overnight there was a special election for an open House seat in the state of Tennessee, and the Republican candidate won. And a win is a win, right? Well, still, Democrats seem to be smiling this morning. Why? Because the margin of defeat was much slimmer than Republicans have been doing in that district. With us now, CNN chief data analyst Harry Enton. Let's talk about the numbers.
Let's talk about the numbers. Republicans should be running for the hills this morning because the blue wave is building, my dear friend, Mr. Berman. What are we talking about here? Well, Matt Van Epps, the Republican candidate, he won it by 9, but this is a district that Donald Trump won by 22 points, 15 points, 17 points. This is a 13-point gain for the Democrats in terms of the margin, and excuse time for Republicans.
Okay. So here's a story that shows even Trump's own Supreme Court appointees have limits when it comes to executive overreach, and those limits are now threatening to cripple one of Trump's most powerful economic weapons. The Supreme Court heard arguments on November 5th, 2025, and cast serious doubt on Trump's use of emergency powers to impose sweeping tariffs on imports from nearly every major trading partner. Justices Neil Gorsuch and Amy Coney Barrett, both appointed by Trump himself, joined the liberal justices in questioning whether the administration's tariff approach represents an unconstitutional grab of power that belongs to Congress, not the president. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust headlines anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
President Trump spoke a little bit about affordability in a way that I think probably alarmed some of his political advisors.
I would think so.
Listen.
This is fake narrative that the Democrats talk about, affordability. They just say the word. It doesn't mean anything to anybody. You just say it. Affordability. I inherited the worst inflation in history. There was no affordability. Nobody could afford anything. The word affordability is a con job by the Democrats.
Look, I don't know whether he wasn't paying attention during the last election, but this is exactly how Joe Biden got in trouble, by insisting that the economy was strong, that the inflation issue was under control.
Let me walk you through what happened during oral arguments, because the skepticism from the conservative justices was genuinely remarkable and signals potential disaster for the administration's trade strategy. Gorsuch specifically warned against what he called a one-ratchet accumulation of executive power taken from Congress, essentially arguing that every time a president claims new authority and Congress doesn't explicitly take it back, the executive branch becomes more powerful at the expense of the legislature. That's not the kind of reasoning that leads to upholding broad presidential tariff authority. That's the kind of reasoning that leads to striking it down. Barrett aligned with Gorsuch on separation of powers concerns, questioning whether the administration's use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, to impose tariffs on Mexico, Canada, China, and other countries actually fits within what Congress authorized when it passed that law. IEEPA gives the president emergency powers to address unusual and extraordinary threats to national security. The administration has claimed that fentanyl trafficking constitutes such an emergency, justifying tariffs on nearly all imports as a response. But Barrett and other justices seem skeptical that an emergency powers law designed for specific crises can be stretched to cover comprehensive trade policy affecting the entire economy. Come on, think about what it means that Trump's own appointees are questioning his signature economic policy from the bench. Trump put Gorsuch and Barrett on the Supreme Court specifically because he expected them to rule in ways that supported his agenda. He's bragged about remaking the court with conservative justices who would back his approach to executive power. And now those same justices are publicly expressing skepticism about whether his tariff policy is constitutional. The court that was supposed to be Trump's backstop against legal challenges is instead becoming another source of legal defeats. The major questions doctrine that emerged from recent Supreme Court decisions poses a particular threat to the tariff strategy. This doctrine holds that agencies can't claim authority to make decisions of vast economic and political significance unless Congress has clearly authorized them to do so. The Biden administration's EPA lost cases under this doctrine when the court ruled that environmental regulations required clear congressional authorization. Now the same doctrine is being applied to Trump's tariffs, and if the court concludes that imposing tariffs on trillions of dollars of imports is a major question requiring specific congressional authorization, the administration's emergency powers argument collapses. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick's entire trade strategy depends on the president having broad authority to impose tariffs without congressional approval. If the Supreme Court limits that authority, Lutnick will have to find alternative legal basis for the tariffs, or the tariffs will have to come down entirely. The cabinet is reportedly engaged in contingency planning for scenarios where IEEPA authority is curtailed, but the alternatives are limited and face their own legal vulnerabilities. The administration could try to pivot to Section 232 national security tariffs, which have a different legal basis but also face legal challenges and have their own limitations. Or Congress could pass legislation specifically authorizing the tariffs, but getting tariff legislation through a closely divided Congress would be extremely difficult, especially when many Republicans represent districts that are economically harmed by the tariffs. The Supreme Court ruling could force a complete restructuring of trade policy that the administration is unprepared for. Businesses are already racing to position themselves for a ruling against the administration. Companies that have paid tariffs are filing claims for refunds, calculating that if the tariffs are struck down, they may be entitled to recover what they paid. Costco has been sued over tariff-related pricing issues. The business community, which has been divided on tariffs, is now actively preparing for the legal landscape to shift in ways that invalidate the administration's approach. The timing of this potential ruling, expected within weeks or months, could create enormous economic uncertainty during an already turbulent period. Markets have priced in the existing tariff regime. If that regime is suddenly invalidated by the Supreme Court, there will be massive disruptions as businesses, importers, and trading partners adjust to the new reality. The administration's economic strategy depends on tariff authority it may be about to lose. The connection to other cases testing executive limits adds context for understanding the court's approach. In Trump v. Slaughter, the court is considering presidential authority to fire agency heads. In birthright citizenship cases, courts have blocked the administration's attempts to restrict citizenship by executive action. Across multiple areas, courts are pushing back against expansive claims of presidential power, and the tariff case fits this pattern of judicial skepticism about executive overreach. So in this video, we're going to break down exactly what the justices said during oral arguments and why their skepticism is so damaging to the administration's position. We're going to look at the legal theories at stake and what happens if IEEPA authority is limited. We're going to examine the cabinet's contingency planning and why the alternatives are problematic. And we're going to discuss how this potential ruling connects to the broader pattern of courts limiting Trump's power. Let's get into it. All right, let's get into the specific legal issues at stake in this case and why the Supreme Court skepticism poses such a serious threat to the administration's trade strategy, because the implications extend far beyond this single case to fundamental questions about presidential power. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, was passed by Congress in 1977 to give the president authority to address unusual and extraordinary threats to national security, foreign policy, or the economy. The law was designed for genuine emergency situations where rapid presidential action was necessary to address specific crises that Congress couldn't respond to quickly enough through normal legislative processes. Presidents have used IEEPA authority for targeted sanctions against specific countries or entities, but it was never intended or used for comprehensive trade policy affecting the entire global economy. Trump's administration has stretched IEEPA beyond anything previous presidents attempted. By declaring a national emergency based on fentanyl trafficking, the administration claimed authority to impose tariffs on virtually all imports from Mexico, Canada, China, and other countries. The theory is that because fentanyl comes from or through these countries, tariffs on all their exports to the United States are justified as an emergency response to the drug crisis. This theory transforms an emergency powers law into a general authorization for the president to reshape international trade without congressional involvement. The constitutional problem with this approach is fundamental. The Constitution gives Congress, not the president, the power to regulate foreign commerce. Article 1, Section 8 explicitly grants Congress authority to regulate commerce with foreign nations. Tariffs are a form of commerce regulation. They're taxes on imports that affect what goods come into the country and at what price. For most of American history, tariffs were set by Congress through legislation, not by presidential decree. Over time, Congress delegated some tariff authority to the executive branch, but that delegation was always limited and specific. Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act allows the president to impose tariffs for national security reasons, but requires a specific process, including Commerce Department investigation and findings. Other statutes allow tariffs in response to unfair trade practices, again with procedural requirements. IEEPA was never understood as a tariff statute. It was an emergency sanctions law. Justice Gorsuch's concern about one ratchet executive power accumulation goes to the heart of this constitutional problem. His argument is that every time a president claims new authority under a broad reading of existing statutes and Congress doesn't explicitly revoke that authority, the executive branch becomes permanently more powerful. The president takes power from Congress, Congress fails to take it back, and the new baseline becomes established. Over time, this ratchet effect transforms the constitutional balance of power without any explicit constitutional amendment or congressional authorization. Gorsuch has been the court's most vocal advocate for limiting executive power under the non-delegation doctrine, the principle that Congress can't give away its legislative powers to the executive branch. His skepticism about IEEPA tariff authority fits this broader jurisprudential commitment. He's not questioning Trump's tariffs because he opposes Trump politically. He's questioning them because he believes in constitutional limits on executive power that apply regardless of which party holds the presidency. Barrett's alignment with Gorsuch on separation of powers concerns is significant because it suggests at least two Trump appointees are prepared to rule against the administration on constitutional grounds. Barrett has also shown willingness to break from Trump's preferred outcomes when she believes legal principles require it. She joined the majority in denying Trump's emergency stay application in the hush money case. Her questions during oral argument indicated serious doubts about whether IEEPA can be stretched to cover comprehensive tariff policy. The major questions doctrine poses an additional legal threat that compounds the separation of powers concerns. This doctrine, which the court has developed in recent years, holds that agencies can't claim authority to make decisions of vast economic and political significance unless Congress has clearly and specifically authorized them to do so. The court applied this doctrine to strike down Biden administration environmental regulations, finding that EPA couldn't claim authority for sweeping climate policies based on general statutory language. The same doctrine applies to Trump's tariffs, with potentially devastating effect. Imposing tariffs on trillions of dollars of imports from virtually every major trading partner is unquestionably a decision of vast economic and political significance. If the court applies the major questions doctrine, it will ask whether Congress clearly authorized the president to use IEEPA for this purpose. The answer is almost certainly no. Nothing in IEEPA's text or history suggests it was meant to authorize comprehensive trade policy by emergency declaration. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick built the administration's trade strategy around the assumption that broad tariff authority exists and can be exercised without congressional involvement. The tariffs on Mexico and Canada over fentanyl, the tariffs on China over various grievances, the threats of additional tariffs on European allies, all of this depends on the president having authority to act unilaterally. If the Supreme Court limits that authority, Lutnick's entire strategic framework collapses. The cabinet's contingency planning reportedly includes exploring alternative legal bases for tariffs, but the alternatives have significant limitations. Section 232 national security tariffs require a formal Commerce Department investigation and specific findings about national security threats from particular imports. That process takes time and produces a record that can be challenged in court. It's a much narrower authority than the sweeping emergency powers the administration has claimed under IEEPA. Congressional authorization is another alternative, but getting tariff legislation through Congress will be extremely difficult. Many Republicans represent agricultural districts that have been harmed by retaliatory tariffs from trading partners. Business interests with influence in both parties oppose the tariff regime. Passing new legislation would require compromises that might not satisfy the administration's goals, and the process would take months or years during which the existing tariffs might be struck down. The business community's response to the pending case reflects expectations that the court may rule against the administration. Companies that have paid tariffs are filing refund claims, betting that they'll be entitled to recover payments if the tariffs are invalidated. Importers are restructuring their supply chains in anticipation of legal changes. The uncertainty is itself economically damaging, as businesses can't plan effectively when fundamental questions about trade policy are unresolved. The timing of the expected decision adds to market uncertainty. The court could rule within weeks or wait months. Either way, the period between oral arguments and decision is one of maximum uncertainty. Businesses know the current regime may be invalidated, but don't know when or how completely. This uncertainty compounds the economic disruption the tariffs themselves have caused. The connection to other cases, limiting executive authority, shows a broader pattern of judicial pushback. In Trump v. Slaughter, the court is considering whether the president can fire heads of independent agencies at will. In birthright citizenship cases, lower courts have blocked executive attempts to restrict citizenship by proclamation. In various enforcement cases, courts have questioned administration authority to implement policies without proper legal basis. The tariff case is one front in a multi-front judicial challenge to expansive presidential power claims. Okay, so let's break this down into the key points that everyone needs to understand, because this Supreme Court case threatens to cripple one of Trump's primary economic tools and reveals how even his own appointees have limits when it comes to executive overreach. Point number one, Trump appointed Justices Gorsuch and Barrett joined liberal justices in expressing serious skepticism about the administration's use of IEEPA emergency powers for sweeping tariffs, with Gorsuch specifically warning against one ratchet executive power grabs from Congress. Trump's own appointees are questioning his signature economic policy. Point number two, the constitutional issue is fundamental because tariff authority belongs to Congress under Article 1 and IEEPA was designed for targeted emergency sanctions, not comprehensive trade policy, affecting trillions of dollars in imports from virtually every major trading partner. Point number 3, the major questions doctrine threatens to invalidate the tariff strategy because decisions of vast economic significance require clear congressional authorization that IEEPA doesn't provide, applying the same reasoning that struck down Biden administration environmental regulations. Point number 4, Commerce Secretary Lutnick's trade strategy depends entirely on broad presidential tariff authority, and if the court limits that authority, the administration will have to find alternative legal bases that are narrower and more legally vulnerable, or seek congressional authorization that will be difficult to obtain. Point number 5, businesses are already positioning for a ruling against the administration by filing tariff refund claims and restructuring supply chains, creating economic uncertainty that compounds the disruption from the tariffs themselves. The significance of Trump appointees questioning Trump's policy cannot be overstated for understanding how this court operates. Trump selected Gorsuch and Barrett specifically because he expected them to support his agenda. He's repeatedly claimed credit for remaking the court with justices who share his values. The assumption was that conservative justices would back conservative executive power, but Gorsuch and Barrett are showing that their commitment to constitutional principles, specifically separation of powers and limits on executive authority, outweighs any loyalty to the president who appointed them. Gorsuch's jurisprudence has consistently emphasized limiting executive power and reviving non-delegation principles. He believes Congress has given away too much of its constitutional authority to the executive branch, and that courts should enforce constitutional limits on that delegation. The tariff case is a natural extension of this philosophy. If Congress has the commerce power and IEEPA wasn't meant to delegate comprehensive tariff authority, then the president is exercising power he doesn't have. Gorsuch's questioning reflects genuine constitutional conviction, not political calculation. Barrett has proven less predictable than Trump might have hoped across multiple cases. She's joined majorities against Trump's position in several high-profile matters, including the hush money sentencing state denial. Her questions during tariff oral arguments suggest she shares Gorsuch's concerns about separation of powers and isn't willing to rubber stamp expansive executive power claims just because they come from a Republican president. The major questions doctrine's application to tariffs creates a powerful legal framework for striking down the administration's approach. The doctrine emerged from cases where agencies claimed authority to make sweeping policy decisions based on general statutory language. The court has held that Congress must speak clearly when it delegates authority over matters of vast economic or political significance. Ambiguous statutes don't authorize transformative policies. Applying this framework to IEEPA tariffs, the question is whether Congress clearly authorized the president to impose tariffs on trillions of dollars of imports as an emergency measure. IEEPA's text authorizes the president to regulate or prohibit various transactions during declared emergencies, language that has traditionally been applied to targeted sanctions, not comprehensive trade policy. Nothing in IEEPA's legislative history suggests Congress intended to give the president blank check tariff authority. Under major questions analysis, this lack of clear authorization should be fatal to the administration's position. The cabinet contingency planning reflects recognition that the legal strategy may fail. Lutnick and other officials are reportedly exploring how to maintain the tariff regime if IEEPA authority is limited. Looking at Section 232 national security tariffs, considering requests for congressional legislation, and examining other statutory bases for trade restrictions. But each alternative has problems. Section 232 requires specific procedures and findings. Congressional legislation requires votes the administration may not have. Other statutes have their own limitations and vulnerabilities. The business community's behavior in anticipation of the ruling tells you how the smart money is betting. Companies don't file refund claims unless they think they have a reasonable chance of winning. Importers don't restructure supply chains based on speculation. The business response suggests sophisticated legal and economic analysis, concluding that the administration's tariff authority is genuinely at risk. This isn't wishful thinking by tariff opponents, it's practical positioning by actors with money at stake. The economic disruption from uncertainty may be as significant as any eventual ruling. Businesses need predictability to make investment decisions, set prices, and manage supply chains. When fundamental questions about trade policy are pending before the Supreme Court, that predictability disappears. Companies don't know whether to plan around current tariffs or assume they'll be struck down. This uncertainty is itself a cost of the administration's legally aggressive approach. For the 2026 implications, a ruling against the administration would be devastating to Trump's economic messaging. He's positioned tariffs as his signature policy for bringing manufacturing back to America and confronting China. If the Supreme Court invalidates his tariff authority, he loses that policy tool and has to explain why his own appointees ruled against him. Even the Trump court rejected Trump's tariffs is a powerful political message. The connection to other separation of powers cases shows courts broadly pushing back against expensive executive claims. The tariff case isn't an isolated challenge. It's part of a pattern where judges across the ideological spectrum are questioning whether the administration has legal authority for its actions. From agency firings to birthright citizenship to tariffs, the theme is consistent. Presidential power has limits, and courts will enforce them. For Commerce Secretary Lutnick personally, an adverse ruling would be catastrophic. He built the trade strategy around assumptions about legal authority that the court is now questioning. If those assumptions prove wrong, his entire approach collapses. He may have to restart trade policy from scratch, working within much narrower legal constraints than he anticipated. That's a significant setback for someone positioned as a key administration figure on economic policy. The irony of Trump appointees limiting Trump's power illustrates something important about judicial independence. Trump selected justices expecting loyalty to his agenda. What he got were justices with genuine commitments to legal principles that sometimes conflict with his preferences. Gorsuch's belief in limiting executive power and Barrett's willingness to rule against Trump when she thinks the law requires it show that Supreme Court appointments don't guarantee favorable rulings. The justices take their constitutional obligations seriously. Looking at the timeline, a decision could come within weeks or months, creating an extended period of uncertainty. The court may issue a stay of the tariffs pending full decision, or let them remain in effect while the case is decided, or rule on emergency basis given the economic stakes. Any of these procedural choices has significant implications for markets and businesses trying to navigate the uncertainty. Anyway, that's where things stand with this Supreme Court case that threatens to cripple Trump's tariff authority and shows even his own appointees questioning his approach to executive power. The skepticism from Gorsuch and Barrett joining liberals on separation of powers grounds. The constitutional problem of claiming emergency powers for comprehensive trade policy. The major questions doctrine, threatening to invalidate the legal strategy. The cabinet contingency planning for scenarios where IEEPA authority is limited, and the business community already positioning for an adverse ruling. Make sure you're subscribed because this case is one of the most significant legal challenges to Trump's economic agenda, and the outcome will reshape trade policy one way or another. Whether the court strikes down IEEPA tariff authority entirely, limits it significantly, or somehow upholds the administration's approach, the implications will be enormous for the economy, for presidential power, and for the 2026 political landscape. And if Trump's own Supreme Court appointees rule against his signature economic policy, that's a defeat that will be very hard to explain away. I'll see you in the next one.